Okay, so first tell me, there's a lot of debate going on about EV, hydrogen, which fuel of the future will carry vehicles around our roads and motorways. Where do you stand? Where does the RAC stand on this current debate? Where are we heading, do you think?
I think where we're headed on the fuelling of future vehicles in terms of cars is pretty clear. The government is backing electric, and it's putting a lot of effort into encouraging the vehicle manufacturers to produce battery electric cars, and it's putting a lot of effort into thinking through what the public charging network should be. It's more of a challenge with commercial vehicles. The bigger and heavier they are, the more we're probably going to need to look at alternatives, and that's going to take us into hydrogen, potentially into synthetic fuels as well.
Do you think the government's doing enough? Some say the government's sitting on the fence. It doesn't really know which way to turn. It hasn't announced much policy or regulation in the same way as it has with cars and vans. There aren't a great deal of incentives for the commercial sector to move across to any new technology really at the moment.
Bringing forward new technology in the commercial sector is always a challenge, because you're talking about smaller numbers of vehicles. Very often, as in the vehicles here at the ITTHUB event today, are bespoke to the companies that are buying them, and therefore making that technology pay for you is harder. Also, I think finding the right technology for heavy vehicles is proving a struggle, not just here but around the world.
And in terms of the infrastructure, clearly we're sort of getting there with car infrastructure, although there's still a long way to go. We have no infrastructure at all for commercial vehicles, particularly long-distance HGVs. That surely has to change before we can move to any kind of EV technology or even hydrogen.
I think it's understandable when it comes to recharging for commercial vehicles, particularly big heavy commercial vehicles, that government and I think suppliers want to get a stronger sense of where the market is actually going to go before they start investing big time. So I think for the time being at least, we're going to be dependent on what the fleet operators install at their depots, and where they can work well with the electricity supply industry to make sure that it's not frighteningly expensive, to ensure that the power supply is enough for what will be quite a drain for those bigger vehicles.
What about the charging network for cars? Clearly the RAC represents motorists, but certainly people are concerned that EV cars are currently too expensive. There is the charging network out there, and as a result they suffer from range anxiety.
For people who could charge an electric car at home or perhaps in the workplace, they could find having an electric car more convenient even than the petrol or diesel car that they're used to having before. Where I do think we have a challenge is in not just the adequacy in terms of numbers of public charge points, but whether they're available, whether they're reliable. And that's something that we really think that the Office of Zero Emission Vehicles has got to focus in on with the industry to make sure that there are charge points where we expect them to be, and if we rock up to them, they're working, and that we can engage with them more easily. Most of us who've grown up as drivers over the last 20, 30, 40 years find using a petrol pump at a service station to be second nature. Trying to engage with some of the instructions and some of the apps you need to connect an electric car to a charger, they're just slightly too off-putting and slightly too complicated. Not totally so, but with a twist I think we could make life a lot easier. What we also need is to recognise that electric cars have been coming through in a wider range of body styles and a wider range of range. You can choose vehicles now which routinely will do more than 200 miles. My suspicion is that between now and 2026 we're going to see a real step change in the capability of the vehicles, and ideally a reduction in their cost.
The government reduced the subsidy for buying an electric car and brought the threshold down to £35,000 for a new car. Do you think that was a good move? Some say it shouldn't have happened, bearing in mind that we're trying to push people towards electric. Others say putting a ceiling at £35,000 is hopefully going to push manufacturers down to that kind of level, which makes EV cars much more affordable, and it could happen sooner as a result of changing the rules.
At the Foundation, we can see the logic of what the government's done in reducing the electric vehicle, the plug-in grant scheme. After all, if you're in the market for buying a 60, 70, 80,000 pound car, I think some taxpayers would wonder whether you really do need £3,500 of their money to persuade you to buy an electric version instead of a petrol or diesel version. I also think that capping the grant at £35,000 vehicles is a sign of the government's desire to see more what I might think of as workaday, ordinary cars, not the supercars, not the luxury cars, but the ordinary cars that people are buying just because they need to get to and from home and work. In that price range, they need them coming into market, and that's an incentive for the manufacturers to get the price of those vehicles down.
Ordinary cars making ordinary journeys. COVID, do you think that's pushed that sort of timetable back, bearing in mind that, a lot of people are thinking twice about going to the office? Where are we heading, do you think, as far as RAC Foundation is concerned?
It's very hard to predict exactly what might happen on traffic and car use as hopefully we come out of the COVID restrictions this summer and start to reopen our offices. Of course, many workplaces stayed open throughout the impact of the pandemic, and people were having to travel there. I fear some of the restrictions that were applied, the advice not to use public transport, has stuck in people's minds. But I also think that we might expect to see some changes, particularly in our city centres, if, as seems to be the case, some employers are going to move much more to a mix of office and home working for their teams. That said, I think it's long been government policy nationally and locally to try to dissuade people from car commuting into city centres. So I think this is probably going to be a bigger challenge for our public transport networks, for the railways and for the bus industry, to be thinking again about the nature of the service that they provide and how they can do that in a really convenient and cost-effective way.
Do you think that there is a risk that we'll just slip back to going to our workplaces, or do you think there is going to be a change as a result of COVID?
It's very hard to say exactly what's going to happen. We've been in touch with various folk, including some of the people who run the serviced offices that have turned up in our city centres in recent years, and they're looking at introducing working hubs in smaller towns and in suburban areas, because they're expecting people who perhaps don't find it convenient to work at home with a laptop propped up on the kitchen table. They want to go somewhere so they can focus, that's away from the distractions of home, but they don't necessarily need to go into the city centre. So we might see a change there. That said, if you look on the Transport Technology Forum website, you can see the tracking of vehicle movements as we've gradually come out of COVID, and I'm afraid the morning and the evening peak do look like they're coming back.
In your role as president of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, where do you think the sector is at the moment in terms of moving towards alternative fuels? Because there is certainly a lot of lethargy, partly brought about by a lack of government action, but also partly brought about by the cost of moving across to alternative fuels.
I think there are two big challenges facing the transport sector, and in particular the logistics and supply chain sector at the moment. One of which is, how are we going to transition into a cleaner future with cleaner fuels for the vehicles? And there's a lot of uncertainty about that, how that's going to work, what that's going to cost, and indeed whether we're talking about battery electric, hydrogen, or some other solution. And the other is about attracting more people, particularly young people, to think of the sector as a good place for a career. We have a major challenge in front of us at the moment in the number of drivers we've got for trucks, for vans, even for public transport vehicles. There's challenges emerging in warehouse management as well. And I think we need to challenge people's perception of what those jobs are like. The idea that it was something that you had to be big, strong, and not mind staying away from home for days on end have largely gone away for most of the jobs in the sector. They'll start early, finish relatively early, and you'll go home every night.
So how can you persuade more people to come into the sector?
One of the things that we're hoping to do in the CILT is work with the trade associations such as Logistics UK and with government hopefully to get more careers advice including the picture of what careers in our sector really looks like in the modern world. Many of us think, if we think at all, logistics, that's lorry drivers. We all know what lorry driving is like, and it doesn't appeal. Actually, the modern lorry, the modern van and the modern truck are really quite nice working environments to be in, so long as you don't mind being on your own for a while. And you don't have to be a hugely muscled individual to be lugging things on and off vehicles. There's any amount of technology that does that for you. So we need to be challenging some of the preconceptions and pointing out that these can be really quite well paid and really quite rewarding jobs.
And just going back to the switch to, say, electric technology, do you think we're going to see the logistics industry change to the point where we do finally see more transshipment going on outside a city centre with only electric vehicles making that sort of what they call the last mile journey, but clearly it is sometimes more than just 1 mile. But do you think we're going to start to see more transshipment going on, whereas at the moment we don't seem to see it on the fringes of cities and conurbations? It's still happening at central warehouses.
I think there are certainly going to be some changes in the way that we think about the logistics of getting stuff, particularly, into our towns and city centres, if indeed we continue to need to do so on the scale that we're used to. I think that we might see a change in the scale of the vehicles. If, for example, we aren't able to crack the CO2 challenge and we can't find a clean way of powering very big trucks, then I would expect to see more of a move perhaps to smaller vehicles. And of course, in town and city centres, we're already looking at micromobility, we're looking at electrically boosted cargo bikes and the like. So I wouldn't say there'll be a single model emerging. I would say there's going to be a variety of changes, which will probably mean that by 2030, the distribution network will look quite different to the way it does today, but it will be a very brave person who said exactly what that's going to be.
Clearly, we've got a deadline for cars and vans and the end of sales of internal combustion engines. We haven't got the same for commercial vehicles, heavier commercial vehicles. Do you think we need that to try and push the market forward? Because at the moment, apart from large companies doing changes as part of their CSR, we're not seeing a massive amount of switch towards electric or even other alternative fuels.
National governments can go so far in setting deadlines for companies to comply with new environmental regulations. For example, the ban on sale of new petrol and diesel cars, which will come in this country in 2030, and hybrid cars from 2035. Where it's difficult is the government does have to take a realistic view on the capacity and capability of the market to provide the vehicles that will be needed. And I don't think that certainty is there yet in the commercial world, certainly not for the larger vehicles.
Just generally, what do you think of the concept of the ITTHUB and what you've seen so far today?
Some of us have been involved in the planning of the ITTHUB for many, many months now, and it's a delight to see it all come together, albeit in a slightly more constrained version that we might have liked. But I think anyone coming here would see the bringing together of a whole range of very interesting and innovative technologies and approaches and vehicle designs, which are all going to be absolutely key to making our country work and our economy work in the coming years.
Stephen Gooding, many thanks.
You're welcome.